The video you shared opens with a punchy claim that a single petrodollar agreement expired in 2025 and that the dollar's global dominance is now on a countdown timer. It's a gripping narrative because it turns something abstract, reserve currency status, into something personal. Your paycheck, your savings, your ability to live normally. But the first thing to understand is this: the petrodollar was never one neat, secret contract with a clean expiration date that flips the system from on to off. That viral framing has been repeatedly fact-checked, and the core claim that Saudi Arabia simply ended a 50-year deal to sell oil only in dollars doesn't match the documented reality. What is real is more subtle, and in some ways, more important. The petrodollar is a system, a web of incentives, recycling flows, security relationships, and market conventions that, over decades, made the dollar the default currency for oil pricing and for the financial plumbing around oil trade. That system strengthened the dollar's central role not because the dollar was backed by oil in a literal sense, but because global commodities trade, dollar funding markets, and U.S. treasuries became the deepest and most liquid place to park reserves. So if the petrodollar doesn't die in a single day, what's the real story hiding inside the script? It's this: the world is slowly building escape hatches. Some oil deals get settled in non-dollar currencies. Central banks diversify their reserve mix. Gold buying rises. And geopolitical risk, especially the lesson many governments drew from sanctions and reserve freezes, changes what safety means. In the data, the dollar still dominates, but its share is no longer the unquestioned peak it once was. And the debate isn't about collapse tomorrow. It's about the direction of travel and how fast confidence can shift when a shock hits. That's where this topic becomes worth a full Finance Channel episode. Not because your dollar is next, in a Hollywood sense, but because the mechanisms that support dollar power, trade invoicing habits, reserve allocation decisions, and the credibility of U.S. fiscal management are under more visible stress than they were a generation ago. And when the world's biggest players start hedging, even gradually, the long-term cost of U.S. privilege rises. Borrowing gets pricier, policy trade-offs get harsher, and the margin for mistakes shrinks. To understand why the petrodollar story has such emotional power, you have to go back to the moment when the dollar first lost its original anchor. In August 1971, Richard Nixon went on television and announced what he called a temporary measure: the suspension of dollar convertibility into gold. In plain language, this ended the Bretton Woods system. Foreign governments could no longer exchange their dollars for gold at a fixed price. Overnight, the dollar stopped being a gold-backed currency and became something far more fragile, a promise enforced by power, credibility, and habit. This created an existential problem for the United States. If the dollar was no longer backed by gold, why should other countries hold it? Why would global trade continue to be settled in a piece of paper issued by a government running growing deficits? The answer was not monetary theory. It was geopolitics. The solution that emerged in the 1970s didn't back the dollar with oil in any legal sense. Instead, it tied the dollar to the most indispensable commodity in the industrial world: energy. Through a series of security and diplomatic arrangements, most visibly with Saudi Arabia, but effectively embedded across OPEC, the United States helped ensure that oil sales were overwhelmingly priced and settled in dollars. That meant any country needing oil also needed dollars. Those dollars didn't sit idle. They flowed back into U.S. financial markets through bank deposits, treasury bonds, and dollar-denominated assets. This process, often called petrodollar recycling, created a self-reinforcing loop. Global trade needed dollars. Dollars returned to U.S. markets, and U.S. deficits became easier to finance. This is the crucial correction to the viral narrative. The petrodollar was never a single contract with an expiration date. It was a system of incentives: military protection, financial depth, political alignment, and the unmatched liquidity of U.S. markets. As long as the United States remained the safest and most convenient place to park surplus capital, the system held even when America printed aggressively, ran trade deficits, or expanded debt. What made this system so powerful was not oil itself, but confidence. Oil pricing conventions locked in demand for dollars, and deep financial markets made holding dollars attractive. Together, They allowed the United States to borrow cheaply and shift inflationary pressure outward. That privilege wasn't free, but it was enormous. And it explains why even small cracks in confidence today attract so much attention. The fear is not that the dollar suddenly disappears. The fear is that the mechanisms which once made holding dollars obvious are becoming optional. Once you strip away the drama, the real question becomes much sharper. Who actually has the power to weaken dollar dominance, and who is mostly making noise? The viral script collapses this into a single villain called the world, but the financial system doesn't move that way. Power is uneven, incentives, conflict, and most actors are far more constrained than they appear. Start with oil exporters. Saudi Arabia gets the headlines, but its position is often misunderstood. Pricing some oil contracts in non-dollar currencies does not automatically dismantle dollar dominance. What matters is what happens after the sale. Even if a shipment is invoiced in yuan or rupees, the surplus capital still needs a deep, liquid, politically safe place to go. Today, U.S. Treasury markets remain unmatched in scale, liquidity, and legal reliability. That is why, despite years of de-dollarization talk, oil revenues still overwhelmingly flow back into dollar assets through global banking channels. Next, look at the so-called challengers. China wants less exposure to U.S. financial power, especially after watching Russia's reserves frozen. But China faces its own trap. Its currency is tightly controlled, its capital account is not open, and foreign investors cannot freely exit in a crisis. That makes the yuan unattractive as a global reserve. Russia, meanwhile, is largely irrelevant as a reserve currency challenger. Its economy is too small, its markets too shallow, and its geopolitical isolation makes its currency unusable for most of the world. Then there's BRICS, often portrayed as an emerging anti-dollar alliance. In reality, BRICS is a coalition of countries with wildly different interests. India does not want Chinese monetary dominance. Brazil wants trade flexibility, not a currency war. South Africa lacks the financial scale to matter. What unites them is dissatisfaction with U.S. leverage, not agreement on a replacement system. That distinction matters. Complaining about the dollar is easy. Replacing it is brutally hard. Central banks are where the story gets serious. They are not panicking. They are hedging. Gradual reserve diversification, increased gold purchases, and bilateral trade arrangements are risk management, not rebellion. Central banks remember history. They know reserve systems don't collapse overnight unless forced by war, internal fiscal breakdown, or policy catastrophe. What they are signaling is not the dollar is dead, but the dollar is no longer unquestioned. Today, one suitor, this is the real power map. The United States still sits at the center, not because it is virtuous, but because alternatives are flawed. The pressure on the dollar does not come from a single enemy. It comes from accumulation, rising debt, political dysfunction, sanctions overuse, and strategic mistrust. None of these kills reserve status alone. Together, over time, they change behavior. The danger is not that everyone abandons the dollar tomorrow. The danger is that fewer people feel compelled to defend it when stress arrives. When people imagine the fall of a reserve currency, they picture a dramatic moment: panic, hyperinflation, bank runs, and a sudden loss of purchasing power. That image is emotionally powerful, but historically, it's wrong. Reserve currencies don't usually die in explosions. They decay through mechanics, and those mechanics are slow until they aren't. The first mechanism is financing cost. The dollar's reserve status allows the United States to borrow more cheaply than it otherwise could. Foreign governments, institutions, and investors buy U.S. Treasury bonds not out of loyalty, but because they are liquid, widely accepted, and historically safe. As long as demand for treasuries stays strong, U.S. deficits feel manageable. The problem begins when that demand weakens at the margin. Not disappears, just weakens. Even small shifts force higher yields. Higher yields mean higher interest costs. And when interest becomes one of the largest line items in the federal budget, fiscal flexibility vanishes. The second mechanism is policy constraint. The Federal Reserve is often portrayed as all-powerful, but reserve status actually limits its choices. If inflation rises, raising rates protects credibility, but risks debt stress. If rates stay low, inflation erodes confidence in the currency. In a reserve system, every decision has global consequences, and those consequences feed back into demand for the currency itself. This is why reserve currency crises often feel like no good options moments rather than clear policy mistakes. The third mechanism is behavioral drift. Trade invoicing habits change slowly, then suddenly. Financial infrastructure adapts quietly. Bilateral agreements bypass traditional channels. None of this looks like collapse on its own. But together, they reduce the automatic demand that once absorbed U.S. monetary expansion. When dollars stop flowing outward as easily, more of them stay home. That doesn't create instant hyperinflation, but it does raise the domestic price level over time, especially for imports. This is where the viral narrative gets something right and something dangerously wrong. It's right that reserve status matters enormously for living standards. It's wrong to suggest that the system flips overnight when a single agreement expires. The real risk is cumulative fragility. A reserve currency survives shocks when confidence is high. It fails when stress arrives after years of erosion. What ends reserve currencies is rarely rebellion. It's indifference. The moment other actors stop organizing their systems around your currency by default, power quietly migrates elsewhere. And by the time that migration shows up in everyday life, the strategic advantage is already gone. Every reserve currency reaches a moment when its internal contradictions stop being theoretical and start colliding in the real world. For the dollar, that breaking point is not a single date on a calendar. It's the interaction between debt, political paralysis, and credibility, each manageable alone, but destabilizing together. Start with debt. The United States can carry far more debt than other countries, precisely because the dollar sits at the center of the global system. But reserve status does not make arithmetic disappear. As debt grows, interest costs grow with it. When interest becomes structurally large, fiscal policy loses room to maneuver. Cutting spending becomes politically explosive. Raising taxes becomes electorally suicidal. Printing becomes tempting. None of these choices are catastrophic in isolation. The danger is that markets begin to price in the likelihood that the least painful option, monetary expansion, will eventually be used. That brings us to politics. Reserve currencies require not just economic scale, but governance credibility. Investors don't need perfection, they need predictability. Repeated debt ceiling crises, government shutdown threats, and institutional gridlock send a subtle but powerful signal. The system is willing to flirt with self-inflicted damage. Over time, that changes risk perception, not panic recalibration. And in finance, recalibration is enough. The final ingredient is confidence, which is not moral or emotional. It's practical. Confidence exists when people believe others will continue to use the currency tomorrow. What sanctions policy taught many governments is that access to the dollar system is conditional. For U.S. policymakers, sanctions are a tool of leverage. For foreign treasuries, they are a reminder that reserves are not neutral assets. Once that realization sinks in, diversification becomes rational, even if alternatives are imperfect. This is the true breaking point the viral script gestures toward but oversimplifies. The danger is not a sudden run from the dollar. The danger is a shift in default behavior. When fewer actors automatically recycle surpluses into U.S. assets, the system becomes more sensitive to shocks. A recession, a geopolitical crisis, or a domestic policy error that once would have been absorbed now lands harder. Reserve currencies don't collapse because everyone agrees they're finished. They fail because, at the margin, no one feels obligated to protect them anymore. And once that obligation disappears, the system loses its shock absorbers. When people hear decline of the dollar, they imagine apocalypse. In reality, the consequences arrive in quieter, more corrosive ways. Living standards don't collapse overnight. They erode. And that erosion is uneven, political, and deeply destabilizing. The first consequence is imported inflation. A country that runs persistent trade deficits depends on the purchasing power of its currency. When that purchasing power weakens, imports cost more. Energy, electronics, pharmaceuticals, industrial components, items the United States no longer produces at scale, become structurally expensive. This doesn't require hyperinflation. Even modest, sustained currency weakness changes what households can afford. Wages lag. Prices don't. The middle class absorbs the shock first. The second consequence is financial repression. Governments facing high debt and rising interest costs rarely choose austerity voluntarily. Instead, they look for ways to keep borrowing costs down without openly defaulting. Historically, that means policies that quietly penalize savers, inflation that runs above interest rates, regulatory pressure on banks and pension funds to hold government debt, and rules that limit capital mobility. None of this is announced as crisis management. It's framed as stability. The third consequence is political radicalization. Currency stress doesn't stay in spreadsheets. It shows up in housing affordability, food prices, and social trust. When people feel that the system no longer rewards work or savings, politics polarizes. Blame replaces analysis. Extremes gain traction. This pattern isn't theoretical. It has repeated across countries and centuries. Monetary stress is one of the most reliable accelerants of political fracture. Globally, a weaker dollar also reshapes alliances. Countries hedge. Trade blocs fragment. Institutions like International Monetary Fund gain relevance, not because they solve problems, but because volatility forces coordination. A multipolar currency world doesn't mean fairness. It means friction. Exchange rate risk becomes a constant tax on trade. Supply chains shorten. Efficiency gives way to redundancy. This is the uncomfortable truth missing from dramatic collapse narratives. The danger is not that everything breaks at once. The danger is that life becomes steadily more expensive, more constrained, and more politicized, while no single moment feels dramatic enough to trigger reform. By the time the damage is obvious, it's already embedded. You don't need the dollar to die for its decline to matter. You only need it to stop making everyone else's life easier. The phrase, "the petrodollar just died," works because it compresses decades of structural change into a single emotional moment. As analysis, it's misleading. As a warning signal, it points in the right direction. The dollar is not collapsing because a secret agreement expired. It's under pressure because the world that once needed it has more options, more mistrust, and fewer reasons to automatically subsidize American deficits. History is unforgiving on this point. Reserve currencies don't fail because of one bad policy or one rival currency. They fail when internal discipline erodes and external dependence weakens at the same time. The United States still holds enormous advantages: scale, innovation, military reach, and the deepest financial markets ever built. But privilege is not permanence. It has a maintenance cost, and that cost is rising. What matters going forward is not prediction, but preparation at the system level. Policymakers face harsher trade-offs: defend credibility or stimulate growth, cut deficits or absorb political backlash, restrain monetary expansion or tolerate higher inflation. None of these choices are painless. What reserve status once did was delay the consequences. That delay is ending. For individuals, the lesson is not panic. It's realism. Monetary systems shape opportunity, but they don't determine outcomes equally for everyone. Understanding how power, debt, and confidence interact is no longer academic. It's civic literacy. The world is moving toward a more fragmented monetary order, one where stability costs more and mistakes matter faster. The petrodollar was never immortal. It was a workaround for a broken gold system. The dollar's future will not be decided by slogans, but by whether the institutions behind it can still command trust when stress arrives. That question remains open, but history gives us the framework to see it clearly. If this analysis helped you connect the dots, share it with someone who still thinks reserve currencies last forever. Subscribe, and we'll keep dissecting the systems that quietly shape your financial reality.